Hello, everyone. Welcome back to the Trauma-Informed Church Kid podcast. Today and every day, we are reconstructing religion for the hurting with theology that doesn't hurt. So let's do a real quick recap of where we've been so far in the narrative of Exodus. The Hebrews, trapped in slavery, have been groaning to Adonai, and he hears, sees, remembers, and knows them, and comes down like a mama bear, offering nacham, both comfort and grief. And the way in which he shows up is through the burning bush, where he reveals himself as Yahweh, he who causes to be, a figure who manifests as the angel of the Lord, who then commissions Moses to be like God to Pharaoh, despite his rather strong fears and reluctance. And what ensues then is where we pick up our story, where we see a battle of the gods begin. And we will unpack that later when we cover the plagues. But in those plagues, Adonai specifically says that he is there to judge the gods of Egypt. And this is a continuation of the theme of the gods of the nations, which we saw as a result of Genesis 11 and the third fall, where Pharaoh saw himself as a god. And we know this because of what we know about ancient Egyptian religion. For them, the Pharaoh was the living embodiment of the god Horus. He was seen as the son of the Amun-Ra, the Most High God. The means by which this happened is that the divine spirit, or the Ka, came upon the Pharaoh at the moment of coronation, and that divine spirit was renewed at a yearly festival. Pharaoh was considered to be not just the secular, but also the sacred leader of Egypt, where he was seen as both the king as well as the most high priest, where he was protected by Horus and wore a cobra headdress, which was the sign of Amun. And that is one of the reasons why Adonai tells Moses that Pharaoh, quote, will not let you go unless he is compelled by a mighty hand, Exodus 3:19. Pharaoh will not give up his power willingly or humbly, because he will see it as an attack and will fight back. Pharaoh will fight tooth and nail to keep himself in power and to preserve all that he thinks he has built. That brings us to a principle that I tell my clients all the time. Unhealthy systems do not welcome healthy behavior. Adonai is coming down to rescue his firstborn son from an abusive and oppressive system. He knows that abusers do not welcome correction. He knows that it will take a sledgehammer, not a hand chisel or a scalpel, to be able to make that happen. And he knows that coming down and rescuing his firstborn son will cause collateral damage. It will come at great cost to others, including the rest of the Egyptians who are inhabiting the realm of this god king. And ultimately, it will come at great cost to the firstborn sons of Egypt. And honestly, this is something we should recognize because we see this all the time in spiritual abuse and trauma. Tearing down unjust systems causes immense hurt to many. It causes many to experience disillusionment and rejection of God. It causes them to lose their jobs and livelihood sometimes. Very often, families are split up and divided. And that is going to be a theme that we will discover throughout this episode that should problematize neat or easy or tidy solutions to responding to oppression and injustice. Because abusive systems do not welcome the truth. They tend to cling so tightly that extrication is likely to be very messy, where a lot of people who have not directly participated in the exact same sins as the leaders might get swept up in the deluge. And resolution is not obtained merely by the overthrow of the system. That is just the beginning of another chapter in the story of justice, because Adonai is committed to working with humans, because he loves all his creation. He even loves abusers whose hearts have been hardened. And that is what Exodus 4-6 tells us Pharaoh has done. Pharaoh hardens his heart because he cannot accept defeat. Adonai, being the Most High God, is a threat to his rule, and he clings desperately to his kingdom and winds up losing that very kingdom in the process. The Hebrew word for to harden is chazak, and what that means is strengthen. The visual image there is binding a girdle on. Some variant translations of that word are to fortify or repair or heal, or to aid or assist, or to encourage, or to tell someone to take courage. And I think that this definition of chazak really should challenge any understanding we have of Pharaoh's heart being hardened as something like, well, he would have let them go, but God stopped him. That's not the picture that the text is painting. Adonai is fortifying the walls of his heart, which Pharaoh has already built. Pharaoh has already put on the battle armor. Adonai is just tying his belt on. Pharaoh's rebellion muscles are already pretty jacked. Adonai is just giving him steroids. And that is why the "I will harden his heart" language is paired with Pharaoh hardening his own heart in Exodus 8:15, 32, and 9:34. Here again, we see the synergy at work. Divine and human, earthly and spiritual, working together. Such as what we've already seen, where Adonai tells Moses, "I will make you like God," to Pharaoh. And that is why I think the best way for us to look at the confrontation between Moses and Pharaoh is actually a confrontation between Pharaoh and Adonai, between the gods of the nations and the sovereign Most High God. To put it simply, Pharaoh's heart is hardened because Adonai shows up. In the 7th century, St. Maximus the Confessor says this, quote, "God, it is said, is the Son of righteousness," citing Malachi 4:2. "And the rays of his supernatural goodness shine down on all men alike. The soul is wax if it cleaves to God, but clay if it cleaves to matter. Which it does depends upon its own will and purpose. Clay hardens in the sun, while wax grows soft. Similarly, every soul that, despite God's admonitions, deliberately cleaves to the material world hardens like clay and drives itself to destruction, just as Pharaoh did," citing Exodus 7:13. "But every soul that cleaves to God is softened like wax, and, receiving the impress and stamp of divine realities, it becomes in spirit the dwelling place of God," citing Ephesians 2:22. End quote. What St. Maximus is describing there is a reality that we know all too well. Our past choices circumscribe our present choices. The horizon of possibility that we have as free agents is limited by our ability to see. To refer back to some of our previous episodes, such as the Anthropology of Adam series, our horizon is limited by the perceptual capacity of our nous, which is our mind or our heart or our intellect. And I said that we should be familiar with this because this is something we see all the time in the context of trauma. Very often, people who have experienced trauma cannot imagine a world where the event does not exert such a pull on their souls as it does in this moment. That's one of the reasons why trauma survivors often yearn for a before. They look for erasure or a clean slate. It's perfectly understandable, but that's just not how human beings or bodies work. Because what is possible is limited by what has happened to us, both our own choices and also the choices of others. Now, is that horizon fixed? Absolutely not. Because by walking toward the Son of righteousness, we may never actually get closer to the Son, but we will expand our horizon of possibility. Choices that once were unthinkable go from contemplated to prepared to enacted. And this is part of the wisdom of divine hiddenness, because for Adonai to show up without the veil causes a reaction. Our person is either clay or wax. If it is clay, it will harden. To mold or to shape that clay at that point is to crack it. That's what we see in the prophetic image of Jeremiah of the potter and the clay. However, if our person is wax, when we encounter the Son of righteousness, it will soften and we will become moldable. Like Pharaoh, we need to be careful what we wish for, because we often think, if only God would, then I would. Honestly, we could be either Pharaoh or Moses. Pharaoh never thought he would play the part in the story he did either. Moses didn't even want to play the part he did. We need to start seeing divine hiddenness as fundamentally for our good, while we seek healing with humility, asking for grace and mercy rather than demanding presence. And seeking that healing can be a little bit tricky because knowledge is not healing. I tell my clients that all the time. I say, if it were, Google would just put me out of a job. Because honestly, we know by and large what we should do. We just often lack the strength or conviction or courage or clarity or something else to actually execute it. The proof that knowledge is not healing is right there in the text of the Bible with Pharaoh. He was given a clear and unmistakable display of God's power, but that was not healing for him because he was clay and not wax. Even the Hebrews did not listen to Moses. In Exodus 6:9, it says that they did not listen because of their, quote, broken spirit. That word there gets translated alternatively as either dejection or misery or faint-heartedness or discouragement or despondency. Also, just simply impatience. And that's one thing that we often encounter when we look at the cries such as, "How long, O Lord?" which, by the way, are incredibly biblical. Now, there is one way in which that is healthy, where we cry out to Adonai as a lament that is rooted in even a mustard seed-sized kernel of trust. However, there's another way in which that "How long, O Lord?" is unhealthy, when it comes out of anger and bitterness and a hard spirit. Now, of course, Adonai doesn't smite us because we come in the wrong spirit. In the case of Pharaoh, he gave him 10 different chances to repent. In the case of the Israelites, they watched those 10 chances, and then he gave them many, many more after that. Because Adonai doesn't just want behavioral change, he wants heart change. And that also is the proof that not only is knowledge not healing, desire is not healing. Very often as a counselor, I've seen people get the desire of their hearts and then lose it, sometimes through self-sabotage, sometimes through fear of success, and sometimes just simply through ingrained habits that go far deeper than just simply the external conditions. That's a good principle for us to keep in mind, because every defense mechanism that humans have is born out of a deep soul-level desire where we are groaning for some good. In fact, I would say it's almost a human rule of behavior that our defense mechanisms bring on the very thing they tend to want to avoid. For example, a person who feels like they really desperately need a relationship is very often going to come off clingy, and in the process of being clingy, out of that need, wind up pushing people away, which will leave them exactly where they started, without a relationship. That is a human thing. It's deeply woven into who we are as fallen creatures. But not just fallen creatures, but just creatures, because our hearts are only satisfied when they rest in Adonai, who is the desire of every heart. Viktor Frankl says that happiness is not something we can pursue. It is something that ensues. Happiness is something that happens to us when we have rightly reordered our whole nefesh. Because healing is not knowledge. Healing is not simply desire. Healing looks like a way, a path, a journey, or a race, something we walk. We do it over a long and slow process. We have to come to the realization on our own. And I mean, sorry, not sorry, the Matrix movie, we cannot have truth just downloaded into our brains. I see this all the time in counseling work. I wind up repeating concepts and ideas many times to clients. Number 1, 2, 3 doesn't really do much. I may not even see any change in 4 or 5, but all of a sudden, number 6 suddenly clicks because they were finally ready for it. Now, it's not particularly their fault that they weren't before. It's just the nature, the nefesh that they were at the time. And that is really important when we look at the narrative of Adonai freeing his firstborn son from slavery. Because it's natural to ask the question, why didn't Adonai just snap his fingers like Thanos and free them immediately? Why didn't he just do one plague? Kill the firstborn, job done. I mean, first of all, it's not at all clear that it actually would have worked in those conditions, because Pharaoh had to be not just hardened, but cracked. Pharaoh went on a journey. Granted, it was a journey to destruction, but the journey was necessary. But it's not just about Pharaoh. It's also about the Egyptians watching and the Hebrews. The Hebrews had to learn about this he who causes to be, who Moses told them about. They had spent hundreds of years in Egypt learning about the gods of the Egyptian pantheon and soaking themselves in the culture of Egypt as well as the culture of slavery. They had to understand Adonai's character to see how futile the gods of the nations are and how small their power actually is. Cognitive scientist John Vervaeke calls this participatory knowing. The Egyptians and the Hebrews had to participate in the hardening and softening, to participate in either the continuing abuse or the deliverance from that abuse. And that really is what we see the picture that the text is painting of Egypt. It is a very abusive system, and it has all the hallmarks. We already talked about how we saw that with Pharaoh, clinging desperately to the power he has built. And that's something we see all the time in abusive church systems. There is a fairly familiar pattern by now. First, there's an allegation. Then there's complete denial. Then there's some kind of circling the wagons, or a countersuit gets sent out. Eventually, the weight becomes too great to bear, either just external pressure or the mounting evidence. Then there's a slight admission of lesser wrongdoing. Finally, an attempt to cling to the power and prestige, and the entire system collapses in the end. Of course, that can be a good thing, but it's also very painful with lots of collateral damage. Because not only the church leaders harden, but so too do the people around them. That's part of what we see in Exodus 4-6. Collusion and complicity, both on the hands of the Egyptian taskmasters and also the Hebrew foremen, because systems of sin make everyone sinners. There is no easy division of identity into guilty and innocent, and those labels, frankly, often serve just to deflect and release blame. Because if someone else is guilty, then I am not, rather than saying, we are all guilty. We are all caught up in the system. Now, I want to be clear, this is not an extreme in either direction. I am not saying that those who lead are able to shift the burden of blame onto those beneath because of this solidarity in sin. Nor, for the individuals, is it a free pass to do and feel and act however they feel like because the system has hurt them. And I am certainly not saying that all those who participate in that system are to blame, and it's really their own fault. That is another hallmark of abusive systems that we see in Exodus 4-6, victim blaming. When the people come to Pharaoh and say, how can we make the same number of bricks when you're no longer providing straw for us? Pharaoh says, you are idle, meaning you're just lazy, in Exodus 5. That too is a pattern that we should recognize, where a system of oppression and injustice is set up in the name of justice. And then the rules of that system and the constraints of it are enforced mercilessly on the people. And then finally, when the people cry out to their representatives saying, hey, I don't know how I can win here, the typical response is, it's a character flaw. It's something in you that's the problem. And that is something that those of us who live in the capitalist utopia of America should be very familiar with. Now, please don't hear me wrong. I am not going full anarchist or communist here. Like we talked about last time, let's not jump straight to labels and black and white thinking. But it's clear, there is no denying that there are systemic downward pressures as well as personal responsibility. And me connecting the dots here isn't erasing either truth. Yes, you are in a corrupt and unjust system. Yes, you are still responsible for your own choices. Yes, responsibility looks different in that context. At the end of the day, blame and fault are just too blunt of instruments to deal with systemic injustices. Now, of course, that never stops people from pointing fingers, and that is, again, exactly what we see in Exodus 4-6, a repeat of the first fall, where Adam points the finger at Eve and God, who gave Eve to him. And Eve, in turn, points the finger at the serpent. Same thing happens in Exodus 5:21 and 22. First, the people, to Moses and Aaron, stink in the eyes of Pharaoh and his servants, and have put a sword in their hand to kill us. End quote. And then Moses to God. For since I came to Pharaoh to speak in your name, he has done evil to these people, and you have not delivered your people at all. End quote. Moses has responded with black and white thinking. And I want you to notice something there. I don't know if you caught it, but Moses conflates you didn't do what I wanted with you have done evil. He's confusing the evil done by others with the evil done by Adonai. He's also claiming about a perceived lack of action, which frankly forgets all that Adonai has already done, both to his ancestors and also to him in the burning bush. Additionally, it has forgotten what he himself promised he would do. And that's exactly what Adonai reiterates in Exodus 6, immediately after Moses' lament. And that's why I'm not trying to criticize Moses or the Hebrew people too harshly. Because frankly, that's very relatable to all of us. We all have made those same mistakes, thinking that the evil done by others is actually at God's hand, thinking that God's present felt inaction is his total actual inaction, or us ignoring what God has promised in the face of our present stress, letting our spirits be broken and our hearts be impatient for justice. In short, we forget the one who is the deliverer. And that word for deliver in Hebrew is natsal. In chapter 3, God tells Moses in the burning bush, I have come down to natsal the Hebrews out of the hand of the Egyptians. That word means to take away, to rescue, to recover, or to snatch out of. The visual image there is of something being torn away, like weeds being pulled out by the roots. Because whenever we are rooted or embedded or entwined within a system, to be plucked out or snatched out of that system causes pain. It feels like being uprooted. And that feeling can cause a reflexive survival response. To me, that is one of the biggest lessons that we should take away from the narrative of the beginning of God's salvation that he is bringing to the Hebrews. Because salvation or deliverance can often cause more pain before the freedom actually occurs. And not everyone can endure it. That's one of the reasons why the author of Hebrews in 3:13 says this, that none of you may be hardened by the deceitfulness of sin. Nothing I have said is intended to blame or shame anyone who has been plucked out of abusive systems, either secular or sacred. This is only to exhort and encourage. Please, for your own sake, do not harden your hearts by bitterness toward God and others, by walling it up in protective layers, by reacting with fight or flight to every perceived threat. Because to do that is to pick up the weapon of the abuser, who has deputized you to keep harming yourself. So please do the hard and risky work of healing. And it is hard and risky because human beings love familiarity. Our brains are pattern recognition machines that make shortcuts called heuristics to make sense of the world. And then we create superstructures of understanding called schemas, and we operate off of these within the world. Think of it very much like building a road, where that road starts off as a walking path, and then it widens and flattens and becomes paved, and finally it becomes a superhighway with multiple on and off ramps. Now, all of that neural wiring is based in truth, but it is not always true. Very often, when our experience of the world doesn't fit these schematics or the data that we have created in our heads, we invariably try to make them fit. Because creating new roads, neurologically speaking, is cost intensive. It causes frustration and delay. It feels artificial and uncomfortable. Thus, it takes a lot of contrary data for us to change. I tell my clients all the time that change never happens until the pain of staying still is greater than the pain of moving forward. And that is one of the reasons why, when we think about being delivered from abusive and oppressive realities, we really need to look primarily at internal deliverance. External deliverance is necessary. However, it is not sufficient. What will really bring freedom is a change of heart, a new path or a road to walk on, and then to run, and then to bike, and then to ride, and finally to fly. And that heart change requires suffering. Not because Adonai, quote, has not delivered these people at all, or has, quote, done evil, but because of the nature of sin, evil, and healing itself. Cancer treatment requires a lengthy recovery and extreme discomfort, but the oncologist is not to blame. Now, it's totally natural that we would recoil from the idea of suffering. It's our basic human wiring. Not only the familiarity issue I talked about above, but also our tendency to seek out pleasure and avoid pain. And that's why I would encourage everybody, as you read through the narratives of Exodus and suffering and affliction, consider changing your relationship to suffering. Now, of course, the best of all is for us to rejoice in suffering, to welcome it as a good gift from a loving Father. I certainly want to acknowledge that that has been used to create theology which causes harm. Passages such as James 1, where he says, "Count it all joy when you endure trials of every kind," has been leveraged to shame people into trying to manufacture feelings, or just to do flat out spiritual bypassing. Or passages such as John 15, where Christ says, "If the world hates you, know that it hated me first." And then people see that as a blank check to go seek out suffering unwisely, reveling in creating conflict by, quote, speaking the truth in unloving ways. I'm talking about neither of those. I'm talking about a path or a way that must be slowly walked, step by step. And this path or way conforms our hearts from those of clay to those of wax. It's important to remember that we might not be on this path of suffering because of our own sin or wrongdoing. However, it can still become the means of removing all sin and all wrongdoing from us. This is the promise of our salvation as human beings, to be rescued from spiritual Egypt and brought in a new exodus to the promised land of. And very often, that journey becomes more painful and harder before it gets better. And we certainly see that in Exodus and Leviticus. The good news is that Christ has suffered before us and with us to redeem suffering itself, even death itself, to transform death from the end, a tomb, into the beginning, a womb. And that's why the apostles can say things like Paul in Romans 5, quote, "We rejoice in hope of the glory of God." Not only that, but we rejoice in our sufferings, knowing that suffering produces endurance, and endurance produces character, and character produces hope, and hope does not put us to shame, because God's love has been poured into our hearts through the Holy Spirit who has been given to us. Or the author of Hebrews in chapter 2, quote, "But we see him who for a little while was made lower than the angels, namely Jesus, crowned with glory and honor because of the suffering of death, so that by the grace of God he might taste death for everyone. For it was fitting that he, for whom and by whom all things exist, and bringing many sons to glory, should make the founder of their salvation perfect through suffering." Or, as Peter says in 1 Peter 4, "Beloved, do not be surprised at the fiery trial when it comes upon you to test you, as though something strange were happening to you. But rejoice insofar as you share Christ's sufferings, that you may also rejoice and be glad when his glory is revealed. But let none of you suffer as a murderer or a thief or an evildoer or as a meddler. For it is time for judgment to begin at the household of God. And if it begins with us, what will be the outcome for those who do not obey the gospel of God? Therefore, let those who suffer according to God's will entrust their souls to a faithful Creator while doing good." In these scriptures, we see all the principles we've discussed so far. Suffering produces endurance that shapes our character to be able to receive and express hope. Adonai brings comfort in suffering as well as solidarity. He has taken on our human condition so that he can heal it. We should not be surprised by suffering, but rather be faithful within it, because it itself is a cup of judgment that reveals who we really are. And all of this is a participation in Christ's own suffering. Like Paul says in Colossians 1, "Now I rejoice in my sufferings for your sake. And in my flesh I am filling up what is lacking in Christ's afflictions for the sake of his body, that is, the church." Somehow, in a mysterious and glorious way, we participate in the creation of the very medicine that makes us whole. As 2 4th-century Christians have said, the medicine of life has entered Sheol and brought its dead back to life, from the Syrian. Or, the cross has not been a disaster, but a healing of creation, Athanasius.
Why don't you explain this to me like I'm 5?
Okay, ready? When God reveals himself, the abusive ruler of the Hebrews will have his heart strengthened, either for his deliverance or his destruction. He chooses to cling to his power. The best path through this fiery trial is to humble ourselves and receive the suffering as a gift of love. And that is part of my challenge to you today, to work to change our relationship to suffering. Now, of course, as always, do what you can with what you have for as long as you can. This is not intended to be a shaming exercise because you're not doing the best. This is not to point fingers and say you were just being idle or blame those being oppressed by sin. This is a gentle admonition and encouragement to start walking a different path. And that path begins with acceptance of suffering. And when you can, when you are given the grace to, move to embrace suffering. And someday, God willing, you might arrive at rejoicing in suffering. So let's start with the first step, how to accept suffering. Stephen Hayes, the creator of acceptance and commitment therapy, a type of therapy I use very often in my practice, says this: we as a culture seem to be dedicated to the idea that negative human emotions need to be fixed, managed, or changed, not experienced as part of a whole life. We are treating our own lives as problems to be solved, as if we can sort through our experiences for the ones we like and throw out the rest. End quote. So the first thing to do on this path to acceptance is to start to treat emotions as information, not as problems. Begin to ask what this emotion reveals about my values, and in so doing, better understand what makes me run well as a machine, and hopefully from that information to realign my behavior and my values. And that goes double if that emotion is unpleasant or unwelcome. Acknowledge that too. Don't bypass it or ignore it. Viktor Frankl, who was himself a Holocaust survivor, says this, quote, "There is no need to be ashamed of tears, for tears bear witness that a man has the greatest of courage, the courage to suffer." End quote. That is why when we experience unpleasant emotions, I encourage my clients to look for the other side of the coin, because unpleasant emotions tell us that something we deeply desire is missing or lost or under threat, and it helps to discover what that thing is and move toward it, but to do so from a place of calm confidence, not, if I don't, then I won't survive. That is the opposite of deliverance. In fact, that is continued slavery through defense mechanisms and fear of death. But instead, come at that from a place of, how will I survive this? Try going from what if thinking to what then thinking. With my clients, I call this looking over the shoulder of the suffering to see what is behind it, and from that to choose what to walk in the direction of. Ultimately, of course, my hope and prayer for all of you is that you will walk in the direction of the way, the truth, and the life, because that is not a path, but a person. He is the Son of Righteousness, even when you have been harmed by his body, perhaps especially when that is the case, because it is only his body that is the medicine of life. It is only through dying with him that we can find the life that is freed from death and the fear of death. He is our calm. He is our confidence. To be wax in his sunlight is freedom and comfort. And I'll go ahead and finish with the words from his own mouth, from Matthew 11:28 through 29. Quote, "Come to me, all who labor and are heavy laden, and I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you and learn from me, for I am gentle and lowly in heart, and you will find rest for your souls." And that's where I'll leave you today. On YouTube and X, you can find me at Church Kid Pod. And on Facebook, you can join the discussion in our discussion group, Trauma Informed Church Kids. This podcast is hosted through Podbean. There you will find links to all the major podcast apps you can find me at, as well as notices and other important information. Please, if you like this content, hit the like button and/or subscribe to whatever platform you listen to. If you have questions or want to engage in dialogue, leave a comment on the platform. I can promise that I will do my best with the time I have to give a respectful and serious answer to a respectful and serious question. If instead you like to troll, I will thank you for your gift to the algorithm gods and happily live my day. The biggest request I would make is for you to rate and/or review the podcast on your platform. This and sharing the podcast are the two best ways to get the word out and get visibility on the interwebs. Finally, just one last word to everyone. I don't know your story, but I know the one who is walking with you in your story. I know that he loves you. He made you for a purpose, and that his plan for you is always better. If you have been hurt by the church, I am sorry for the ways in which we have borne the name in vain. That is our responsibility to repair and repent. I hope that this podcast starts you on your own journey to find resurrection on the other side of deconstruction. My prayer for you is the words of St. Paul to the Ephesians. I ask God that you may know the love of Christ, which is more than we can ever know. I ask that you may be filled with everything that God has. See you next time.